Let's get joined up. This week's show is sponsored by Bandcamp.com, an online record store and music community where passionate fans discover, connect with, and directly support the artists they love. There's thousands of bands and artists on there, including my band, the Rye Dogs, whose second album, Pigs Might Fly, is out right now. Here's a quick snippet of the title track, which is also available on Spotify, Amazon, and Apple Music.
Because your eyes may be weeping, but your conscience is sleeping. So baby, don't you cry. Your faces are drying and you say...
It's totally free to join Bandcamp, and as the Rye Dogs are brand new members, we're now looking to grow our fan base, so your support would be greatly appreciated. Just search the Rye Dogs, that's W-R-Y Dogs, and hit the follow button. Right, now we can cue the theme tune.
Joined up writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly, and it's episode 172 with Jack Lutz, debut author of a new dystopian suspense thriller, London in Black. It's a lovely conversation that covers tons of stuff about the power of characters driving the story and Jack's interesting path to publication, which involved a very meticulous approach to submissions. Speaking of submissions, I'm still on that lonely road paved with rejection, silence, and occasional, hopefully anyway, at some point, glimmers of feedback, being now a few weeks into subbing my book, Safe Hands. So I've had 2 rejections so far, neither of which gave me any specific feedback, and I'm just hoping that if I'm unsuccessful on this first round of submissions, that I at least get some tiny hints as to what I might improve or why I'm being rejected. Otherwise, it's a little bit difficult to form a plan for what to do on the next wave of submissions. Even a hint of what they do like would give me something to go off, but the reality is there's also a strong chance it just isn't for the people I'm sending it to. It doesn't float their boat, light their fuse, wet their whistle, or insert another cliche here. Of course, there's another obvious answer, but no one really wants to say that out loud, so I'll just whisper it. Maybe it isn't good enough. But I'm clinging on to the positive feedback that I've had from trusted readers and my critique group along the way that tells me there's something there anyway. If only I can just find the right partner to help me get it out to a wider audience. I'm looking for someone who shares my passion for this book, but also recognises that I've got a voice and other stories I want to tell, including a possible sequel to Safe Hands and a new standalone called The Rushes, which I'm currently working on. So stay tuned for me telling you more about those in the coming weeks and months. So that's me, but how are you all getting on? What's going on in your writing worlds? Get in touch to tell me what you're up to, and feel free to fire at questions at me as well. The best way to get in touch is via email, wayne@waynekellyWrites.com, but you can also tweet me at JU Podcast or drop me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk. It's totally free, and you get a couple of downloadable goodies when you sign up, as well as being the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Okay, let's get ready for today's interview with Jack Lutz. So Jack lives in London with his wife and daughter. He's fascinated by the city he calls home and loves to read about and explore it. And as you'll hear, the idea for London in Black came to him as he changed trains on the tube. So London in Black is his first novel, and it's out everywhere right now. It's a great cover as well. So enjoy the chat, and I'll pop back at the end for a sign-off.
Joined up writing.
So thanks for joining me on Joined Up Writing, Jack. Really appreciate it. So why don't you just start off just by telling us how things are going and give us a sense of where you're speaking from as well.
Yeah, sure. Of course. Things are going great. I'm here at my flat in Limehouse in London, and I'm looking out at the river, and it's a nice night. So it's great. Everything's great.
Very nice. Very nice. Now I'm detecting, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm detecting in that accent, Jack, that you're not necessarily London born. Could I be right in that?
You're right. I came over, it's been 12 years,
Wow.
I think.
And
So,
you stayed all that. There must be a significant other or something involved in that decision, surely.
well, my wife's American too, so we both came over and just loved it. Just loved London.
That's
Just
great.
loved
That's great.
people.
Well, it's kind of a nice segue actually for you to tell me about your debut book, London in Black. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So, it is no surprise set in London, and it's set in London in 2029. And in this world, in 2027, terrorists started using a new nerve agent called London Black. And so when the book opens, a scientist is killed, and the cop who's investigating the murder, her name is Lucy Stone, thinks that he developed an antidote for the nerve agent. And she really needs that because the drugs that she's relying on to protect her aren't working for her anymore. And so the book is about Lucy chasing this killer and chasing the antidote that she needs to stay alive.
Brilliant. Sounds like a very thrilling premise. So do you remember the kind of jumping off point or the inspiration for the story?
Oh yeah, very, very clearly. So I was changing trains on the tube, and I was at Canada Water Station, and um, suddenly this character just popped into my head. It was very, very sort of instantaneous. It
Mm-hmm.
was just like she tapped me on the shoulder and was sort of there I am. And really the plot came from the character, I think, because I just had this character, this Lucy's just when the novel opens, she's just in a really, really dark place. Um, she's got massive PTSD from the initial wave of attacks, and she's in this tiny flat. She's painted the entire thing black. She doesn't sleep. She's got really bad nightmares. She's got awful rage attacks. And, you know, and there I was sort of getting ready to get on the tube. And suddenly I had this person just sort of in my head.
So that's kind of unusual in a way. So the character came first, and then out of that, was it? Do you think kind of fully formed in terms of you knew that there was something wrong or there was PTSD, and then it was a case of kind of working backwards and thinking what might have caused her to be like that? Was it kind of engineered in that way? Do you think?
I think the first thing that happened was I just had this picture of her. So what she has to do in this in 2029 when the novel opens, because there's these ongoing attacks and she is vulnerable to the nerve agent. And only like 10% of people are vulnerable to this nerve agent. Everybody else, it's just like tear gas.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way she can survive, she's got to inject herself with a drug every day. And it's immensely painful. And I just had this image of her just injecting herself, and it was just awful. And so I think the plot came from that, I'm sure. Um, why, why was she like the way she is? Why is she so, why is her life so dark? And why is she injecting herself with drugs? Um, but her character, sort of her feistiness and stuff, was pretty much right there from the start.
Brilliant. And obviously there are kind of I know it's a nerve agent and all the rest of it, but there are kind of echoes of a pandemic, if you like, in the premise. And I don't know whether you know, but we've had one of those quite recently.
I'm a bit aware. I've heard about it a little bit. Yeah,
it's kind of been a marginalized news story, but you might have picked it up.
yeah. Yeah, it's funny because actually what I've just told you about that happened in 2019.
I
So
thought that, yeah, I was going to ask you that because I know sort of how the timescales are publishing, so I figured it might be something that kind of came about before. So if that was the case, I mean, obviously since then, presumably you were kind of working on it, even if it was editing or whatever. So do you think some of that fed into it, or if it was
oh
before, how did you feel as you kind of watched the actual pandemic play out, knowing that you'd kind of come up with this premise?
well, so what happened was I actually started writing in November 2019.
Hmm.
And so when the pandemic really started kicking off, the whole thing took me about 6 months to write.
Hmm.
And so I was maybe two-thirds of the way through when the pandemic really started hitting and really hit and reached London. And so even though the plot was more or less there and formed, it wasn't at all like I plotted this in response to COVID. But um it actually, I'm sure it fed into just my tone as I was writing and the pace because I was writing it so fast to the end, just because everything that was going on around me, the world felt like it was ending. And it was really surreal because there were times when I wrote about something and then a few weeks later, something similar happened. And it's funny because in the book, um, most of the action is set 2 years after the main attacks. But
Hmm.
there are some flashback chapters where we're sort of following her as she's going through the worst of it. And that's where there were these sort of echoes that were very strange. Um, but in terms of like the darkness and the bleakness, I mean, the plot was already there, but didn't, I'm sure that got reflected as I went through and as I was
Yeah,
editing
especially
and
if you
things
were
like that.
writing, as you say, sort of ended up writing a lot of it in early 2020 when it kind of, especially those first few months, it did kind of feel quite apocalyptic, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there were just, strange echoes of things where I'd write about, you know, going to a local shop and trying to get supplies or something. And then a few months later, I'd be doing that myself
Yeah.
and like runs on, all sorts of different products and things. And then that sort of happened. But it really was pretty far along by the time the pandemic really hit. So it, I don't know. It was very surreal. It was very
Yeah.
surreal and it was sort of awful.
Of course.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Feeding into it. So when it came to actually, so you finished writing the book, obviously you go through editing and all the rest of it, but then when you come to actually try and pitch the book and try and get it out there, did that kind of did that work in your favor or against you? Because I know it's kind of split. I've spoken to lots of people, and particularly in like sort of 2020 and 2021 to a certain extent, you saw a mixture of people saying, I don't want any, I don't want to read anything about a pandemic. I don't, people were like, I'm not interested in, agents were sort of saying, I don't really want to read about a pandemic at the moment. I don't. So how did you find? Did it work to you in your favor, or did it not really play a part?
I definitely don't think it worked in my favor. I
Hmm.
think, I mean, for me, the path was I was very fortunate, I guess. And, I went out on submission and, I went to my agent pretty much first. And, the guy who wound up being my agent pretty much first. And I didn't actually know until really recently, both for my agent and for my editor. Um, like I'd never talked to them about the timing. And I didn't know whether they knew and realized that I'd written it before the pandemic or whether they thought it was some sort of reflection on the
Reaction to it.
pandemic.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and both of them said the same thing, which was we just assumed you'd written it before the pandemic and that it wasn't meant to sort of, I mean, it's because it's really not, I mean, there's similarities in a sense, but it's not a sort of set in the middle of a viral pandemic. And,
No, no, no. It's just
but I,
kind of,
but
as I
I
say, it's
definitely don't
kind of
think it,
just, yeah, echoes with it with
yeah,
injections and different bits and pieces, and the fact there's something horrific's kind of happened that's kind
exactly. I
of.
mean, it's a public health crisis that
Mm.
is happening. And obviously we were going through a public health crisis as I was in the process of sort of pitching and stuff like that. But I definitely I don't think it helped. But um, and I've had the same thing. I've had discussions with people saying, I spent all this time writing a book about a real pandemic, and then the pandemic kicked off, and it's impossible to pitch.
Yeah, sure,
I
yeah.
mean, I don't think it helped, but I think I was just lucky enough that it didn't hurt, and that everybody involved realized it was different enough. Um, and now it's very odd because it's 2 years on, and the book is really set 2 years after this,
Yeah, yeah.
this really dark
There's
thing, and
another
so the
echo of
timing
it.
is kind of interesting. But I wouldn't recommend trying to write a story immediately before something that in any way, shape, or form replicates itself.
No, absolutely. So on that, tell us a little bit more about your path to publication. So you're saying that the first person that your kind of first choice, if you like, the first person you submitted to, that's who ended up being your agent. Was it kind of a long process, or was it, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, in terms of sort of stepping back, like overall path, I knew I wanted to write. I mean, I think I probably started writing, stories and stuff when I was like 7 or 8. Actually, I was at my mother's and I was digging around and found a short story that I'd written when I was like 7, and it was a
Mhm.
crime story set in London, which was hilarious in retrospect. But
Mhm.
I I really thought that's what I wanted to do when I was in my mid 20s. But I sort of realized that as I was finishing up law school. And so I was sort of stuck going off and being a lawyer, which is great in its own way. But it wasn't until really the start of 2019 that I sort of rolled up my sleeves and said, okay, the time is now. If I'm ever going to write, I need to write. And I actually took a course. I took a course with Jericho Writers. I don't know if you know them, but
I do, yeah, yeah.
okay. So I took a novel writing course, and I actually started this book as a screenplay. Like I was working on a different novel, and I had this idea and thought it would be great fun to write it as a screenplay. And um, then I was sort of booked onto this course with Jericho, and so I had this character in my brain, and I couldn't put her down, and I didn't know what to do, and so I decided to roll it over and have it be a novel. So I took the course with them, and at the very end, there were people on the course who really liked it and were very kind. And Jericho said, "We'll do a manuscript recommendation for you, and you go do some research and figure out one agent, and we'll send it to them with a recommendation."
That's
And
great.
so it was wonderful, but I felt like I had this one shot to
Yeah,
find, the agent of my dreams. And so I just spent an incredible amount of time doing research.
yeah.
Um, and then he wanted to see the full, and then he signed me up.
That's great. And who is your agent for people that don't know?
Yeah, his name's Jordan Lees, and he's at the Blair Partnership.
Brilliant. And do you remember, I mean, was there a long time in between when you sent it off with that recommendation? Was there a nerve-wracking wait? How long did it take?
Um, so he actually came back and asked for the full the same day,
Wow.
um, which I mean, obviously I wasn't expecting, but it was so fast that I didn't have time for an agonizing way to just,
Yeah, that's a
um,
nice
yeah, no,
situation.
it was absolutely amazing. And then he came back 2 weeks after that,
That's brilliant. And do
on the
you
full.
remember the phone call or the email when you got
But
it? How
yeah,
did you feel?
I definitely do. I remember I got the email and it came through Jericho, and it was an email saying, I really like this. Can I arrange for a call with Jack? And but I didn't know what that was going to be, because that could be, I really like this, but do you want to rewrite it and then I'll consider it?
Yeah.
Or, I really like this, but sorry, it's
Yeah.
too pandemic-y, or whatever. I didn't know at the time. And then we had the call, and it was really great.
That's
Um,
brilliant.
yeah, it was one of the best calls of my life, obviously. So I was very, very lucky, and I know I was lucky. It was just really smooth.
Well, yes and no. I mean, like all of these things, you have to, that's okay, but you wouldn't have got the recommendation if the book wasn't, good in the first place. Obviously, somebody saw something in it, and then, you took your time to research the person that you wanted to send it to, and all the rest of it. So you kind of have to make your own luck to a certain extent. So well done.
Well, thank you. But I mean, that's kind of you to say. At the same time, I know there's just a tremendous number of really, really, really good stuff out on submission. So, you know, the only thing I can say is the amount of time I spent doing the agent research was really immense. I basically took a list of about 100 agents, and then I cut it down to like 30 who, really did crime and thriller. And then what I did was I figured out who they represented, and I tried to read a chapter from every one of their clients' books, which I could
Hmm.
get free on Kindle.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
But it was just amazing, because I noticed that there were people who, on paper it looked amazing, but then I read the authors they represent, and I realized I just didn't sound anything like them, and I knew I had one shot, and so I didn't want to waste that on somebody that.
And that's interesting. Did you sort of find, because I always think that's an interesting question anyway, when it's one of those things when you speak to agents and they kind of struggle to articulate what it is that they're looking for. They'll just say, well, I just know to a certain extent. But did you find when you were looking at some of those author samples, because not a lot of people do that, to be honest, and that's a really good tip about actually reading samples of the work. Because often you'll go on an author's page, an agent's page, and they've got the record, they represent sort of 30 authors or whatever.
Right.
And often you might not know the authors, or you haven't read the books or whatever. And obviously you kind of took it that next step and you read it. But did you find that there was kind of a consistency? So let's say you picked, a particular agent. Did you find you could sort of see kind of a thread in the types of people that they represented, or was it kind of a bit random?
There was a bit of a thread, and to be fair, there were agents who represent many different types of authors. So
sure, yeah,
there weren't very many who was sort of only crime and thriller, and so I basically just only read their crime and thriller clients because I knew, if they also represented romance or something, it wouldn't be anything like it. But yeah, there's a lot of similarity actually, and I mean, it was a little bit over the map because no two writers are the same, but it was an interesting exercise, and it was also interesting because it was a little bit different than the list of what agents say they like, because you see that a lot too.
Yeah,
You see like, well, what's the, give me the 10 books you've read most recently when you read 8 interviews with agents, and they'll say things. And then you'll look at their clients' books, and they're different. And that
that's a good point, because I often find it can be quite off-putting when you're looking to submit to agents. You look at some of the stuff that recently I've read this, that, and the other, and you think, well, that's nothing like my book.
Yeah.
or it's literary fiction, or whatever. You think, well, there's no genre stuff in there, or whatever it happens to be, and it can be quite intimidating sometimes, I think.
I'll be honest, every single piece of it was immensely intimidating. Just looking at agents' sites
I agree,
made me feel ill, because it was like, I'd look at every author's page, and I'd just be like, oh, look, there's so many authors who are published, and it's so intimidating, and the odds are so long. But I just sort of did it. But yeah, and I think, I mean, if you were to go look at what Jordan likes to read, it's interesting too, because I don't think, I've seen his interviews too, and I don't want to speak for him, but, to some extent they're different too from who he represents, but in a really interesting way. And for him, I just liked both things. I liked his clients' books, and then I liked some of the things that he said he liked, which were authors like Borges and Calvino and stuff. And I was like, I really think I like what this guy reads, and I like who he represents. And to me, that was, those were the two pieces that I was trying to put together. And so I thought, well, I'll give that a go.
Obviously you clicked.
Well, I was very lucky.
That's great. So then, so you get Jordan on board, and then how did it go from there? Were there lots of edits suggested by Jordan before you went to an editor, or did you go straight to an editor and then you got kind of started working on it? How did that work?
It was, there was a round of edits, maybe 2. We did them fairly quickly. So I think I signed up at the end of December, and then it was obviously sort of the end of the year and holidays and things like that. And so we started working in January, and I think we went out on submission maybe at the start of March. So it was pretty quick.
Yeah, pretty quick. Yeah,
it was pretty quick. I mean, it was really fun reading his comments too, because what I sent him hadn't really been, I hadn't had anybody else really edit it. I had a couple people who looked at the first 2 chapters, and there was the guy who was the sort of teacher on the course, is a guy named Craig Taylor, who's an author. He writes a CM Taylor, and he was great. And he gave feedback on the first couple chapters in particular. But beyond that, I hadn't had like a full edit of it. And so reading Jordan's comments was really an interesting thing.
And what sorts of comment? I'm not asking you to be really specific.
Yeah.
But what sorts of things sort of came out in those early edits?
Well, there were some that were sort of like, well, a lot of it was, I'm not following this. Can you add a sentence somewhere? Because a lot of it was very plot specific because, it's I've got to sort of build this dystopian world, but because of the pace of it, I have to do that really, really, really quickly.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I sort of had to set the stage for, well, there were terror attacks, and here's how the nerve agent worked, and here's who survived. And, there's just a lot of world building that has to happen really quickly. And I
Hmm.
didn't want to distract from the reader at all. Like I wanted to just open as fast as humanly possible. And
And
so,
yeah, and obviously not, as you say, not put them off with like tons and tons of exposition.
yeah, exactly. And so, one of the things he did was be a sounding board for, well, this is just a little bit, you've got to add a sentence or something to explain this here because sure, if you get to page 47, then, you'll explain it, but you've got to put in something here. And so there were edits like that. I mean, it was just really helpful. Some of them, they were style edits. I had a tendency to have, you know, for some of the sort of internal monologue stuff, it was really, really, really choppy intentionally. And so we played with that a bit. But it was just really fun. It was really actually a fun process. I know that sometimes, writers hate editing, I guess, but I just found it fun. Um, so we did that, and then we went out on submission in maybe early March, I think.
That's great. And then was it a long process from there? Presumably not, because obviously with where you are now with the book being out and stuff.
Yeah, it was pretty quick. We went out and we had an offer come back in about a week and it was from Pushkin. The first to come back was Pushkin, who is who published this book, and it was amazing for me because I loved Pushkin Press, um, and I started reading Pushkin books, years before. I really like they're I don't know how familiar you are with them, but they're they're really great. Um, they sort of started off really doing lots of books in translation and sort of forgotten books from the sort of 30s and 40s. And I really love Stefan Zweig. And I started reading his stuff, and it was all put out by Pushkin. And so for me, it was just the most phenomenal thing to get an offer from a publisher that I had tons of Pushkin books on my shelves, and I really loved the stuff they put out. So it was
That's
great. It was
great.
pretty
So there's
quick.
again that connection there.
Yeah, it was really. I probably when I was changing trains on that too, I probably had a Pushkin book in my bag. Probably is the honest
Yeah,
truth.
yeah, yeah.
So it was
It
really
was meant
great.
to be. So give us a sense of how you so from what you were saying. So London in Black is that the first novel? I know it's your first novel that's being published. Is that the first novel that you have actually finished or written? Because
No,
often that's not the case.
no. So I started a novel. Um, I'd started a novel almost 10 years before, and I'd worked off and on at it, but I'd probably only ever gotten, I don't know, 15,000 words or something. And it was
Right.
just, I couldn't, I could never find the time. I was working around the clock. And then um, in the start of 2019, I had another idea for a story, and I wrote the entire thing. I wrote like 80,000 words, and I was working with um, an editor at Jericho and sort of polishing it. And then I had this idea for London in Black, and I just had to stop working on that and just start this because it was just so strong in my head. And so I never submitted that. I haven't done anything with it. Um, but
Do you
I
think you'll
actually, but
return to that or?
I mean, I may, I haven't yet. It's so different stylistically. And I feel like there's so many things that I've learned that it would be a huge rewrite. And I mean, right now, what I'm working on is another book as a sequel to London in Black, and so it's there, and I like the main character in that book too, but I really just put it aside. Um, but yeah, so it was an entire. I mean, that was sort of 8 months or something of just writing every day, all the time. Um, and so it wasn't like this book that's published was the first novel I wrote. There was a whole nother one, and I'm sure that process would have been totally different, and I'm sure it would have been much longer. And Um, so
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, it's usually the case for most people. It's often not the first book that they've written; it's the first book that get published. What do you think you learnt in writing? Well, the two books really, but what do you think you kind of learnt from the process of writing London in Black? I mean, in terms of things that you've taken on to the next projects that you've worked on.
um, I mean, really, just you know, quite a few things. I think. Um, I guess I spent a lot of time thinking about story structure before I started writing London in Black, and then sort of seeing how it developed and how I plot. And I actually spent a lot of time reading books that were really designed for screenwriting.
Yeah.
Um, but I found them phenomenal. So have you ever read anything by Dara Marks?
I don't think so. No.
She's got this book. It's brilliant. It's called Inside Story, and it's just about sort of character arcs and things. And I read a bunch of that, tried to apply it. One thing that I learned early that's not a big thing, but it's a little thing, was just to write everything down. Because what I found was for this book, almost all of it was written in my head at some point,
Hmm.
either like from a plot perspective or even the words, the dialogue, but even the non-dialogue parts. I'd think about it. I'd go to bed and I'd think about it, and I'd lie there in bed just thinking about the chapter I was going to write the next day. And what I sort of forced myself to do was just every time I had anything, any kind of thoughts, I'd force myself to sort of reach over, grab my phone, and write a note.
Hmm.
Um, and I probably would have forgotten half of it if I hadn't. So,
And then you've got something to go at the next day. So did you find with the, because I know exactly where you're coming from as regards the screenwriting books.
yeah,
I've read a lot of
I've
those, and I
read,
think particularly from structure and things like that, I think they're really really helpful. And obviously they're designed to, as you say, structure a film or whatever. But it's at the end of the day, it's a story. A story is a story, and they often hit the same kind of beats. Um, so when you sit down, or when you sat down to write London in Black, did you just sort of, obviously you had the idea for the character and a rough idea of where you're going? Did you just hit the ground running and start writing the first scene that came to mind, or did you have a kind of gestation period, or did you try to plan before you cracked on with it?
I really tried to plan. And I think um, I spent, I'm sure I spent more than a month just planning. And some of that was character. Um, I did this. So what I didn't do, but what I did with the first novel that I tried to write was do like a character sheet where
Hmm.
it's like 100 questions and you go through and you answer all the questions. And instead, what I did was basically do like a first person character interview where I
Yeah,
just sort
that's
of
great.
sat
Yeah.
down and just sort of typed in her voice. And it was, I mean, to me, it was amazing because for me, like a good day, I write maybe 600 words, something like that,
Hmm. Hmm.
800. And this, I sat down and just let her go. And it took, like, by the next day, I had, I think, 6,000 words
Hmm.
in her voice. And like, I used huge chunks of that in
Hmm.
the book itself.
Did
And
you
so,
write? Is the book written in what perspective is the book written in? Is it written in
sort
first,
of close third
close
person,
third? Yeah.
um, but there's so much sort of internal monologue
Yeah.
that then becomes first person that it just sort of transitions back and forth.
Hmm.
And so it's in that where I've got big, huge chunks of stuff, because, you know, knowing everything about her life fed through in so many ways because she was so traumatized by all these people who died in her life and just different difficult things that she went through. And so when I was actually writing, it was really easy to call back because I knew everything about her. It felt. And so I spent a bunch of time doing that. Actually, that wasn't that much time. That part came fast, but the plotting, I spent a lot of time.
Hmm.
And sort of get your get your climax and then figure out your midpoint. And I mean, I knew the inciting incident because it's a crime novel and there was a murder, so I had that.
Hmm.
But it was really like gritting and drawing arcs and working out, you know, what's going to be the pinch in the middle of 2A and stuff like that. So it was really very, um, it was pretty plotted in advance, although I kind of thought I had it all tidied up. But what I found was um, I didn't I didn't do it too granularly. And what I found was there were things that I kind of made up as I went along based on something that happened in chapter 4. Like I'd pull that when I was in chapter 15. And so I guess, for me, the lesson I learned was to really spend a lot of time and really try and plot it at a high level, but then give myself space to leave little threads for myself that I can pull later on. So there are characters who become important, you know, in the second half who I had no idea they were going to become as important. But once they existed, I decided I would use them.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. So it was somewhere in between, and then I had to do a bunch of research about things like nerve agents because I didn't have any idea about those either. So yeah, I mean, it was a good month or two or more of research before I actually started typing.
And then off you went. Obviously, it's your debut published book. So, in terms of tell us a little bit about how that experience. I know you're kind of still early on in the process, but how has that experience been for you? Is it kind of different to what you might have imagined? The whole process before you got an agent, before you had an editor, before you got published, and all the rest. You probably had an idea in your head of what it meant to be a published author, to be a debut. How have the two things differed from what you thought it would be and the reality of it?
Oh, it's really surreal. Is the first thing. I mean, I walked into a bookshop um, last week and saw it out on the shelf, and uh, it was completely surreal, and it felt like up until that moment, it wasn't real, and I was constantly worried that I would get some email saying it was all some mistake, and I mean, really, and then I saw it. It was really surreal and fun. But it's also, uh, you know, to me personally, I don't know what other authors think, but to me, it's like I feel like incredibly vulnerable because there's a story, and I hadn't really told many people that I was writing at all. No one, I
Mhm.
mean, my mother knew, my wife knew, but that's it. I hadn't really told friends or family or anything. And suddenly it was like, oh, I've got this out there and it's really fun. But at the same time, then I realized that people are actually going to read it that are and I mean like friends and family and stuff. And
What's been the reaction been from people that didn't even know that you were writing it?
um, well, none of them, I mean, so I've just started getting friends who have had it show up in the past day or two. So
Right.
almost no one's had the chance to actually read
So
it,
you're
which is
nervous.
terrifying. Yeah, I'm terrified. But it's also just, you feel vulnerable because there are people out there that you don't know that are reading it. And it's such a personal thing that, you know, I know at some level if somebody hates it, that doesn't necessarily mean they hate me as a person, but you're really putting a piece of yourself out there. And for this story, I just identify so strongly emotionally with the main character that it really feels like it's probably doubling down.
Mm.
So it's really, really, really fun. And I had this, I get to talk to people that are really interesting. I get to talk to you. I get to talk to booksellers. No, seriously, you know, it's amazing. And I get to talk to people who I would never have had the chance to. Um, but it's definitely terrifying in its own way.
And exciting, obviously.
Super exciting, exciting and scary.
What do you think people that are sitting at home or wherever listening to this now, that they're on their journey and they might be submitting, or they might be putting the finishing touches to what they hope will be their debut novel or whatever one day? What would be other things that you think, what kind of advice would you give to them as they head off into this? Is there anything that kind of surprised you or kind of wasn't exactly what you thought it was going to be? Whether that, it might have been better or worse than you expected it to be, but was there anything that kind of caught you off guard? Or
Yeah, there were a number of things, and some of those were things that happened after even after I went out on submission, after I went out on submission to publishers, the process itself was very slow moving in a way. And that was a bit odd, right? I don't think I really appreciated how even after, you sign a contract and then it's sort of over a year before your book comes out. And I didn't realize how long that would take. But but more than that, I think um I don't know. I would just say you've got to keep going. And, like I said, it, I was very, very lucky with this book, but I wrote a whole other book. And, um, I kind of wrote it. I went all the way through it. I edited it once all the way through and I looked at it and I was like, I'm not confident if I go submit this that it'll get anywhere. And so I had to sort of pick myself back up and write something completely from scratch. And I just think you have to keep going because, um, there's there's so many stories of people who go out and submit a million times and then finally break through. And there's just no other way. You just have to go through that process.
What would you say has been the best piece of creative advice that you've been given along the way? It might be writing specific, or it might just be general kind of creativity advice or whatever.
Um, there's been so much. I think um, to have such a focus. I had somebody tell me to just have everything be character led, and um, I'm not sure that was the advice that I had in my head when I wrote this book, but looking back, it's what I did, and um, it was really good advice in retrospect.
So
Be-
let the character lead the story.
yeah, and I think I think to some level it's dangerous, but to some level, if you really identify with your character, it sort of forces you to keep going. And if you really care about this character that you're writing, I couldn't stop. Like I couldn't give up because I knew if I gave up, then she wouldn't complete her journey through this book. And I needed that to happen because I cared about her. Um, and so I think part of it is your character really matters because at the end of the day, if your readers don't care about the character, then they won't want to keep reading. But for me personally, I mean, writing is it's so difficult and it's just such a tough process that if you really care about your character, then you want to do it for them.
It's tough, but obviously you still keep coming back to the page every day or most days.
Yeah, and there's a lot of times where I truly felt like I was being dragged along by the character, where, you know, I didn't, I mean, it's really sometimes painful to write, right? You just sit down and you look at your laptop screen and it blinks back at you and it's terrifying, right? And, but I just didn't have a choice because I just had this person in my head just with this drive and I just felt like I had no choice. And one thing that's kind of funny is, I mean, there's all different sorts of plot structures, and this book is basically a quest. And I guess I felt like I was going through that quest in my own way as I was writing it because my quest was to finish the book and her quest was to find this antidote and find a killer. And so it kind of reinforced, I think, like I kind of felt like I was going through that journey with her. But I just felt this immense responsibility, like I had to finish writing because otherwise, what would happen to her? And I guess I realize it's insane and silly, but
No, it's not at all. No,
it was
it's
a
a great way of looking
huge,
at it.
it was
If
a
you're
huge,
invested in your character, then there's more chance of the reader being invested in it.
I, yeah, I mean, I like to think so. But it's absolutely the way it worked for me. It was sort of, I felt like I had to keep writing. And it was weird because it's a character who does not like or appreciate other people helping her out. It's the last thing she wants. And so that was a bit of a weird tension,
Mm-hmm.
but there was no other way to do it. She couldn't write it herself. So I just had to sort of do it. And I guess she had to just deal with that.
That's absolutely, yeah. So as we kind of move towards wrapping things up, if you could start again tomorrow, this whole crazy writing career, is there anything that you'd do differently, or is there anything that you would tell your younger self? Do you think?
Um, Yeah, I mean, I think I'd tell myself a whole bunch of things, but I tell myself to just persevere because, you know, it's this book, it felt like it may feel like it was quick, but really looking back, I mean, I was trying really hard to write for over a dozen years. And I would just tell myself, you've got to believe and you've got to have faith and you have to just keep going because um, there's no other way to do it. And you can't think that the very first thing you write will be, the best thing because this is really for me, this is I guess novel three. The first
Hmm.
one didn't even make it past, I don't know, I think I wound up in it probably wound up being like 40,000 words or something before I just stepped away from it.
Hmm.
And that's a lot of time. I mean, the one that I was writing before this, that was like 9 months of writing every day. And I realize in the grand scheme of things, that's great because, so many people write for a dozen years or 15 years or 20 years. But, at the time it felt really grueling and I was exhausted from work and it would have been really easy to junk it. So I would just make sure I didn't.
Yeah, don't give up, basically.
Yeah.
That's
I realize
brilliant.
it's sort of probably what everybody would tell themselves looking back, but it's so true.
No, it is. It is. It's one of those things. And it's one of the hardest things to hold on to sometimes when you're in the in the woods, so to speak, and you kind of you can't see any light, and you think, as you say, I've been working on this for ages, but is it ever going to see the light of the day? Light of day? Is anybody actually going to read it, or should I start something else, or should I just give up entirely? So I definitely think those are things that writers, even writers that are a few books into their publishing journey or whatever, they still have those kind of doubts day to day. So I think it's worth reminding yourself that you wouldn't have got where you are unless you'd have just carried on going regardless.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I mean, it's also true. Like I have those doubts absolutely right now. Like I'm still terrified. Like I'm terrified that the next thing I write, everyone will realize, oh, that's awful. I mean, and so it's advice that I'm giving to my former self, but like it's hopefully I take it now because it's really,
It's a good reminder.
I don't know if it'll ever stop. It'd
No,
be
I don't think it will.
scary. I don't think so.
Okay, that's brilliant. So just before we wrap things up, why don't you just tell people where they can find out more about you and your work online, social media, and all that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I've just opened I've just started up a Twitter account, which I didn't have. I didn't really have much in the way of socials before all this. And so I've just got this Twitter account up. It's Jack Lutz author, all one word. And um and that's been difficult because when I write, I like to sort of obsess over every word and suddenly I've got Twitter and each time I tweet takes me like an hour to sit there and stare at it. It's not really built for someone who writes like
I
me, I
think you're
think.
overthinking it, Jack.
I probably am, but so I'm there and I've got a website that is still a work in progress, but should be up um, hopefully in a week or two, which is jacklutzauthor.com. And you can find out more on the publisher's website, Pushkin Press.
Brilliant. And the book's out right now, isn't it, as we record this?
It's out right now. It's out. I've just seen it in bookshops across London.
That's brilliant. Well, I've seen the cover and I'm going to have a go at it. It looks great. I love the premise. And yeah, good luck with it, Jack.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for having me on. It's been wonderful.
Joined up writing.
Okay, thanks again to Jack, and I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk, or you can find them in the podcast description on whatever device you're listening to this on. That's pretty much it for this week, but don't forget to get in touch with all your thoughts on the show, your feedback, and to tell me what's going on in your writing worlds, and you can do that by dropping me an email at wayne@waynekellyWrites.com. Also, remember you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews, and it's a lot, by the way, on the website. So make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. And that way you can have the podcast downloaded automatically every time. Also, remember to leave us a nice rating and review on whatever platform that you listen to it on, because it does help others find the show, helps me grow my listenership, and it means I can keep going doing what I'm doing. Either that or just tell one of your mates. That would be great as well. So that's it for this week. So thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.